In the context of high achievers and thought leaders, industry leaders, movers and shakers, and I'm talking to you about peak mental health. Where does Dr. Hooper's brain go to define that?
Well, it certainly goes to something different than the opposite of mental illness. And I think that's a temptation, is to think about, well, mental health must be the opposite of mental illness. And I don't see it that way. Mental illness is an aberration on what otherwise would be optimal functioning. So I would rather, as you're doing today, talk about optimal mental, emotional well-being. And so my definition of that, and it's not the only definition, but it's one that I'm comfortable with, is that peak mental health is living with yourself and others in a way that is authentic, ethically integrated, and gracious. Living with yourself and others in a way that is authentic, ethically integrated, and gracious.
That's good. And we're going to unpack that.
Okay.
If we were to, at a high level, look at the components of this definition, what would those components be?
Well, since the first part is living with yourself in a way that's authentic, then the first is to know yourself authentically. And I look at what I call the four pillars of spirituality in terms of authenticity. And the first is to be awake. Be awake to what's going on inside of you, between you and others at any time, and around you in the world. Be awake. The second is to be thoughtful. Think about it. Be curious. So I need to be awake to what's going on in me all the time, to think about it, to be curious about it, not necessarily to rush to judgment, but to be thoughtful, that is, full of thought about that. Why did I say what I just said? Why did I do what I just did? Is that in alignment with my deepest values and the core of who I understand myself to be? So peak mental health isn't a state that is static. It's a dynamic state where we're constantly able to interact with ourselves in evaluation and constant, sort of like one would do at the rudder of a ship, making little course corrections along the way. So if you have a time when you don't feel that you're being totally authentic with yourself, being awake to that is part of your greater authenticity. Do you follow me on that? Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. I think it also gives a definition that leaves it open for the fact that you actually don't ever arrive, right?
That's right. And as I say to people all the time, there's a difference between a trip and a journey, or a trip and a pilgrimage. A trip is about getting from point A to point B. But we don't spend most of our time stepping over thresholds. We spend most of our time on the journey from point A to point B. It's wonderful and necessary that you got your Doctor of Medicine degree. But what really matters to everybody is what you learn from point A to point B and what you have continued to learn and put into practice.
And actually getting that degree was only the right to continue learning and practicing.
Exactly.
This is Simon Sinek calls it an infinite game.
Right.
We're all playing games. Everything we're doing is a game. Some games have beginnings and ends and winners and losers and a scoreboard.
Right.
Those are finite games. And those have different set of rules and different set of strategies to be successful. But infinite games, they don't end. They end with death. And one of them is our relationship with self.
Right. So it's more like being an athlete, if we want to use that analogy, because an athlete is constantly growing between games and from game to game. Exactly.
Right. Is there a way that you could coach someone to begin the journey to improving or identifying or investing in that authentic self?
Yeah, the first place I would begin with, which would actually be with gratitude for what is good and sweet and true in their life. Start paying attention to that. And that may sound like it's completely different from what you're asking, but I think it's important for folks to get a broader perspective, to notice what is energizing for them, what's not about them in the world, so that they get some perspective. And then from that humble place of gratitude, to really get curious about themselves. You know, I think people can be instructed to pay attention to what they're doing and ask, why did I do what I just did? Why did I say what I just said? And not in a way that's accusing, just from a place of gathering more information. Right. And also, I think, find people who are kind and thoughtful and care about you and get their feedback. What do you see? What do you hear?
You know, we did an episode on rethinking addiction, and I can't help but think about the power of curiosity.
Absolutely.
About others and of self.
Yes.
The
right.
rethinking addiction between two professionals is, if we were far more curious about why the pain, not why the addiction, we would be much more impactful in our journey in helping people with addictions. But this is kind of like turning it on itself and saying, Aaron, why don't you be a little more curious about why you might be anxious?
Right.
Or why you have everything that you think you want, you're checking boxes, but you're not happy, or whatever the case may be.
Right.
Be curious
Right.
about yourself.
Right.
I love
Right.
that.
Yeah. And for people, and I find this happens all the time, they can't name what they're feeling inside. They can name about 7 different emotions, and then they run out of them. So I give them, actually, you can go Google this, okay? Go Google this list of emotions,
Yeah, there's
list
like
of
8,
feelings.
6, 7, some.
And you'll get pages of different emotions that are permutations of the basics. And if you don't know what you're feeling, start going down that list, because it's easier to figure out, oh, that's what I'm feeling, rather than trying to name it. Because people are more aware. They've been introduced to the idea, but they may not be able to name it in themselves.
Curiosity and gratitude. What a beautiful combination of traits to foster.
Yes.
For others and for self.
Right. And it keeps us from a rush to judgment. If I can be curious about you and think to myself.
Or judging yourself.
Right. If I can be curious about you, about myself, it'll keep me from a rush to judgment. I just had that this morning.
Can you say that again? That was so good. I
don't know if I can.
That
curious about others and yourself will keep you from a rush to judgment.
Of yourself and others.
Right.
And I think hasty judgments create a lot of downstream regret.
They do. Right.
And where we can minimize regret, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Which is back to your being thoughtful.
Right.
This is really good, and that's just the first component.
And it can happen, as it did to me either yesterday or this morning driving, was somebody did something in front of me that wasn't helpful and was moderately dangerous. And I had to stop and say to myself, I don't know what that person is going through.
Yeah.
I need to let that go right now. And it brought my blood pressure down, doctor. It brought my heart rate down. And I felt better about me.
It's so good. Curiosity.
Yeah.
Being willing to take 1 second and ask a curiosity-based question.
Right.